Well, good evening, everybody, and happy July. And I hope everybody's doing well and staying cool. It's awfully humid here in Chicagoland, so hopefully you've got something cold to drink and are kicked back and ready to talk about freedom, and especially in the context of the Naomi Klein video, which I had sent out earlier with a suggestion to watch it. If you didn't watch it, we'll talk enough in depth that you'll have an idea of what we're talking about. But if you did watch it, all the better, because it was a very insightful interview, and getting kind of past the Democracy Now! People's thoughts on being very negative and attacking Trump and the Republicans. What Naomi Klein talked about was extremely insightful, and so we're going to go over that tonight and then look at some ideas for how we can help kind of transfer what she's talking about into framing, because what she's talking about in terms of branding and changing the brand is in essence framing. So we'll kind of translate that into framing, and then how we can make that happen with the skills we already have. And I titled this Redefining a Contested Idea. Those of you familiar with Lakoff's Whose Freedom, it's a great book, good read. It goes really in depth on the term freedom and how that is a contested idea between progressives and conservatives. Of course, the conservative idea of freedom is dominant. We'll get into that specifically later. But how pretty much everybody understands the progressive idea of freedom. It's just one of those suppressed emotions, if you will, or suppressed ideas in the progressive frame. So I thought this was a good way to bring about changing people's perception of freedom to have it be more progressive. So Naomi Klein's new book is titled No Is Not Enough, and it is directly related to her book The Shock Doctrine, because she's using her observations and her experiences and her discussions with people about the shock doctrine and everything that's going on at the moment kind of as one big shock strategy. She's looking to the past and saying, okay, all of the responses from progressives and activists to all of the recent shocks have basically been just to say no, to resist the shocks, to say no to the shocks, we're not going to take it, to get angry about it, to protest, create organizations and grassroots groups and things like that, to resist them. And the point she makes, kind of the bottom line point, is that historically and recently is not enough to overcome conservative corporate power that is creating all the shocks. So a few of the examples that she points out specifically in the interview segment that I sent you, that she identifies as shocks, are, first of all, the 2008 recession, and then the austerity that was imposed on the U.S. population immediately after the 2008 recession. And she points out that pretty much all, and yes, thanks for pointing that, resist is a very common word, and it has been in practice for a long time, but especially today, it means that, that basically negation activity, both through language and action. So the austerity is still in place. She points out that even with all the upheaval, you had the spring, Democracy Spring, you had uprisings all over the nation, you had the Occupy Wall Street, huge efforts pushing back against austerity and saying no to austerity. And those didn't work because we are still living under the auspices of that austerity that was enacted after the 2008 recession. So nothing's changed. She mentioned specifically all of Trump's daily shocks. It happened during the campaign at a time when, different times when people said that Trump would crash and burn and that he would never be the Republican candidate because he was just such a loose cannon. He was a novice politically. He didn't know how to identify with moderates. And, oh boy, here we go. He's going to crash and burn this time. And each time people thought that, he would turn around and here comes another shock. He used Twitter to activate the shocks. He used language. He used actions. Basically, a marketing campaign to activate these shocks, which didn't distract people, as Naomi Klein points out, but it reinforced his brand. And then, of course, the media and people would respond to his shock in a way that would reinforce his brand. So getting a little ahead of the discussion, but that's how that figures in. And then I added this last one, the war on terror. She didn't specifically discuss the war on terror, but if you read what George Lakoff has written about the whole metaphorical meaning behind the war on terror and how powerful that is to keep people in kind of a constant state of alert and shock and fear, that's another example of shocks that are fairly recent that have been resisted through negation and protests and just say no kind of thing, and yet persist. And in any of these three things, we've not seen any kind of pivot away from any kind of ideas or language or action that will move us away from that frame, that authoritarian frame, and into a more empathetic, progressive frame. So the next slide, I kind of tried to summarize her, I guess, kind of her bottom line of the effect of all this and kind of how Trump's strategy is exactly the right strategy to succeed at this time. So all of you who are watching this know that the authoritarian conservative frame is dominant right now. We all know what that looks like. And obviously that branding is framing. And what it does is it defines our perception of Trump. And it's important to remember that this is all happening cognitively. So even if you don't agree with it, even if it makes your skin crawl and you cringe, even if you don't agree with it, you understand it. And your brain accepts the metaphors. Your brain physically embodies those ideas and metaphors so that they're accepted, which then you start using them as well. We all start using them, unless we are able to consciously understand that and then pivot away from it. So the important thing is that branding, as she calls it, which is framing, defines our perception of who Donald Trump is, and it also predicts behavior. So his behavior is expected because of the branding. So it kind of normalizes in our brains. We stop being shocked and appalled at it because of how that frame embodies itself. She also makes a really important observation, is that this kind of branding, this method, this extent, depth, whatever you want to call it, has not existed politically on the scale we're seeing it today. And obviously that's largely a result of things like social media that have, Twitter and Facebook instantly sharing things that can be seen by thousands of people in a split second. So for example, in FDR's day, when you could argue that FDR kind of accomplished the same thing with his four freedoms on the progressive side, he had nowhere near the kind of saturation in branding that Trump has now, largely because of social media and also how he's covered by the 24-hour news cycle, where anything new becomes news because there's complete saturation. So kind of the perfect storm in terms of how it's on a much bigger scale than we've ever seen. So translate that to how big the influence is on people cognitively, again, who even disagree with Trump or are on the fence. So the other thing she points out is that Trump comes off as this megalomaniac, cutthroat, ultimate authoritarian, self-absorbed, misogynistic. Okay, so greedy. Go ahead and throw out any other adjectives you think are appropriate. And she points out that, just identifying him as such doesn't weaken him. It doesn't change people's perception of him, because that's his brand. That is the brand that he has worked decades to develop very, very intentionally. I'm just going to grab a quick sip of water here. And she relates a story about, for those of you who have watched the video, she relates that story about the people who were on The Apprentice. The Apprentice, where he fired people. And she relates a story to them about all of the off-camera, very demeaning tasks that he had these people do. Things like, cleaning bathrooms and cleaning up after parties and just very, very kind of dirty, demeaning work. And she points out, that was part of his building the brand of that, he's this kind of cutthroat, ultimate authoritarian. So, and he lives it. I mean, this is authentically who he is. So, again, for those of you who are able to see the video, she talks about this idea of the only way to really get at this and change public discourse is to, as she calls it, jam the brand, or jamming the brand. And what she's saying in terms of jamming the brand is fundamentally reframing. She's basically saying to, if I go to the next slide, there we go. So the way Trump's brand succeeds is because he's authentic, he is consistent to the nth degree. This brand succeeds by, as I said before, he defines and predicts, or it defines and predicts his actions. So we understand that brand as who he is. And most importantly, for the purposes of as she calls it, jamming the brand, or as we would call it, reframing, it provides his followers and people in general a vision of what they could be or have and have. It's what he has. It's the wealth, it's the authoritarianism, it's the, as he has said, the respect. I mean, how many times did he say, we'll be respected again, we'll be great again? You know, all those things. And so when he says, make America great again, it's like, make America great like me. You know, that's how people perceive his brand. And again, whether you agree that that's true or not, you understand it and your brain has accepted it. And so therefore, that brand succeeds because of all those things. So when we talk about reframing, or as Klein says, jamming the brand, the answer is, and she actually talks about this kind of idea of providing a new and different vision for the future that's transformative. And, you know, along with that, you know, my friend Mike McCabe, when we've done events together or we've talked, I mean, he always talks about finding a new language, abandoning the old political language. So language is part of that. Action is a big part of that. And being consistent with it. So providing that new progressive vision for the future, which is transformative, means that we have to provide that positive vision of what people could have or could be that is remarkably different and morally different, right, from what Trump is talking about. So that's the pivot aspect of it. And it, as she says, as Naomi Klein says, it requires rebranding. It requires framing. So that is kind of the summation of her interview. I haven't read the book yet. I just watched the interview, and then there's another in your daily dose that went out today. There's another link to a kind of a discussion that she had at some kind of a big bookstore. And it's quite a lengthy watch. It's like 45 minutes long. But it's really good. She gets very in-depth into this idea of rebranding and how Just Say No is ineffective. So I would like to read the book as well. It's new, so highly recommend it. So kind of transitioning now into framing, my feeling was that in terms of rebranding, that there's no better place to start than with freedom. And I noticed last week when the healthcare debate was still, you know, red hot, and there was still a possibility that we would see a new, some type of something care act of some kind from the Republicans. You know, George Lakoff tweeted out something about, you know, you can't be free if you don't have health care, or health care is necessary for freedom. And it struck me because that he had kind of come up with that phrase quite a few years ago. And it certainly seems just, or possibly even more relevant now, that there is the possibility of people losing access to health care because of what the Republicans are looking to do. So there's no better place to start than with freedom, because the idea of freedom and health care go hand in hand. And what's important about that is, and I've talked to some people about this, and everybody seems to understand both frames of freedom. People are very biconceptual on the idea of freedom. So, for example, everybody obviously understands the idea of being free to do what you want. So having personal freedom. However, if you suggest to people that the freedom that you have comes with a responsibility to other people's freedom, and you can use a very simple illustration of that by saying, well, that's why we have zoning laws, so that your neighbor can't impede on your freedom and your quality of life by doing something that goes against zoning laws that would harm you. And also, people have a tendency to want to help friends and neighbors and relatives in need, with the understanding that your life is better if the people around you's life is better. So your freedom is, you're more free if the people around you are free, etc. So even conservatives understand those ideas. And while they may be more dominantly in one, the fact that they understand the progressive provides us an opportunity to reinforce progressive idea of freedom with biconceptuals. And the key to that, obviously, kind of a recurring theme here, is to evoke empathy and the idea of caring for other people's freedom. So I thought it would be good to, because since you have to know kind of where you're at in order to get where you want to be, thought it would be good to review the current dominant view of freedom. And you really see this everywhere. This idea of freedom is on, just watch a TV commercial for a car, and how they relate your personal freedom with that car or any other product. So that this view of freedom is everywhere. So personal liberty there's a few important ideas. First, that your personal right to do X, to do some action, supersedes the government's right to impede your liberty. And this is a very libertarian idea, but it also is one of the foundations of the conservative frame, because that makes government immoral, because government cannot impede your personal liberty. So the second thing is, the more moral, disciplined, and self-reliant you are, the more prosperous and successful you will be. So in the conservative frame, in this dominant view of freedom, there is a moral equivalency between how successful you are, i.e. Donald Trump, and how moral and self-reliant you are, therefore worthy of being an authoritarian leader. So along with that goes the kind of the opposite of that moral view, is that if you're poor, you deserve your poverty because I am immoral and undisciplined. And this is a deeply seated cognitive idea in our society. And even people who are struggling, many of them believe this. Many of them believe that if they just worked harder, if they were just better people, if they just, pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, and did the right thing, they would be successful. So, very important view of personal liberty, that they deserve their poverty, they deserve their circumstances because of their moral shortcomings and them being undisciplined. So, therefore, the view of freedom is that people who are wealthy deserve more freedom. Why? Because they're more moral, right? So these people who are buying their way into favorable tax laws, and companies that get huge tax breaks and other incentives to put a factory in some city or some state and make billions of dollars in profit while the infrastructure crumbles and schools don't have sufficient funding, is because they're the job creators. Right? They are more moral and they are more, so they should be more free because of their discipline, their success. So those are all related. So very important to understand. And as you can see from what we just looked at, so that dominant view of freedom reinforces that Trump brand, reinforces his frame. So here's the point. When you attack him, or when someone attacks him as being selfish or greedy or misogynist or all of these things, or that he doesn't care about the little guy or whatever it is, right? That just reinforces it, because that is who he is and that is his frame. So just saying no is not going to be effective. Okay, so this is something that Naomi Klein didn't really talk about because it's not really in her sphere of expertise and discussion. So this is just for me. So this idea of rebranding freedom, so it's critical so that people are able to perceive, even and most importantly unconsciously, why Trump and conservatives don't share our values. Right? So you don't want to attack them on issues, or you don't want to attack them as people, but what you want to do is you want to undermine their frame by evoking our idea of freedom, which most people understand, and do it over and over and over again with repetition and consistency on every issue, so that people start embodying and unconsciously accepting the progressive idea of freedom, which comes with the responsibility to care for other people's freedom, and that's a moral imperative. Once that is accomplished, then people will have the unconscious reaction. For some it will be conscious and visceral. To Trump and his ilk, they will have a response that is kind of a gut feeling that, hey, this just doesn't feel right. And maybe at first they can't explain it, but it'll raise questions. And that's how this change starts. So the important ideas here are that, first of all, as we all know, progressive freedom requires empathy. You've heard me say this idea that our freedoms come with the responsibility to everybody else's freedom. That is empathy. Something like if my neighbors aren't free, neither am I. These are things that can apply to issues like public education. Look, if my neighbor's kid isn't getting a good education, then that doesn't help me. If my neighbors don't have clean water, then that harms me and the entire community. So what's important about those first three bullet points there is that translates into deeper understanding that the public, which is all of us working together through government, is necessary for freedom. Right? Why is that? Because through the public we can provide protections to protect people's freedoms, freedom from want, go back to FDR, freedom from fear, right? And we can provide the things that empower people's freedom, right? So freedom of speech, freedom of to worship the way you want or not worship at all. Freedom to pursue a prosperous life and have opportunities no matter who you are, where you're from, etc., right? That those are all possible because of the public, right? So the idea is that we get people to understand this idea that democracy requires us to live the idea of progressive freedom. So those are some really important ideas. Translating those into action is a little more complex, but starting on any given issue and finding ways to translate messages on issues into these types of ideas are a place to start. And I put a few up there, and so these I'm going to cover these fairly regularly in the Daily Dose. So give you food for thought and ideas there. But for example, as I said on education, obviously being educated is necessary to freedom, and public providing that. Some of these are no-brainers, but progressives and Democrats have not been communicating these in that frame. Too many times it gets stuck in the market frame, in the choice frame and things like that. So it really takes an effort. The idea of inequality. I mean, if a lot of people in our communities don't have the same opportunities or freedoms we do, obviously that harms the community. And if somebody in our family is in a situation like that, don't we have a responsibility to them in terms of their freedom to pursue a meaningful life? So that ought to translate to everyone. Things like infrastructure. Obviously, the Elizabeth Warren little speech that I used a bunch of times, and it's just the best example of talking about how nobody got wealthy on his or her own. How, look, we all pitched in to build infrastructure and systems so that people would have opportunities and freedom to pursue a prosperous life. And yeah, exactly. Great comment, right? Who doesn't understand that in order to be free, you have to have protections from crime or from your house burning down or any of those things, right? And those are all things that we can come together on and provide each other. And there is a sticking point here. And it's interesting, I had a conversation about this with someone today. The sticking point is, the question is always, well, who's going to pay for it? Right? Where are you going to find the money? You even hear it on the news, right? So they'll talk about, providing a service or building a road or whatever. And the first question out of the reporter's mouth is, well, how are you going to pay for this senator? Or how are you going to pay for this congressman? Exactly right. Our tax dollars are our investment in creating opportunity, but also there's this opportunity here to point out that there are people who are who don't care about others. They only care about themselves, right? People like our sitting president. People like the officers at Boeing or any other company, GE, that doesn't pay their fair share of taxes. Right? Those people are unpatriotic. They take from us, they take the money that we have invested in infrastructure and all the things that provided them with educated workers and the ability to reap huge amounts of profit, and they have extracted, but what have they provided, for the community in exchange for all the things we've done for them? So there's opportunities there to start pivoting that. And of course, you can just hear the conservatives are going to say, oh, well, they create jobs. Right? So there's the opportunity to, not respond in the job creation market frame, but to stay in the community, caring for others, all the things that we've done together, and you have a moral responsibility to care for not only the people who work for you, but the entire community. And make it a moral issue, make it a patriotic issue. I think right. Yes, as progressives, we tend to avoid the whole patriotic conversation because we're afraid that the conservatives have co-opted it. But isn't it patriotic to care for your neighbors and to look out for each other? So aren't those our values? So, yeah. So, and look at, we don't have any technical glitches. This is good. So, in closing, there have been a few comments. I think tonight was, a little bit more like a classroom session. So, especially because there was the subject of the video that we were discussing. So, feel free to email me with any other questions. The Daily Dose, the link is, when it's posted, the link is arriving in your email. And all you need is your subscriber password to access the full blog. Just so you know, I will be putting this out to the subscribers in the next couple days, but I have been posting brief excerpts of the Daily Dose on Facebook and Twitter. So if you want to follow me on Twitter, here I'll type my Twitter. This is my Twitter right here. So that's my Twitter handle. So if you want to follow me on Twitter, if you're not already, so I'm tweeting out through my WordPress blog, which the link is right there, progressivevaluesblog.wordpress.com. So I'm tweeting them out through that, and that's for public consumption. And it's basically a shortened version. You all, as subscribers, are getting all the here's what to do. For the public, I'm kind of saying, look, here's a problem. So here's a problem. There is a way to fix it, and all of you are getting the answers. And then also on Facebook, I'm also putting them out on Facebook. So gives you the opportunity to kind of spread the word to people of what the challenges are, and that there are solutions, and that there's a whole bunch of us who are working on on getting those solutions implemented in terms of messaging and communications. So, excellent. So, yeah, thanks to everybody who was on tonight. I appreciate you taking time out of your summer. So, summer's always a little challenging in getting people together, but appreciate you taking the time. And I can cut to one last view of my giant head here. So have a great rest of your July. Hopefully I'll see some of you around on the streets or what have you. And feel free to email me or get in touch with me through social media or whatever with questions and comments. So have a great night, everybody. Thank you.